Thank you. Thank you for coming out on a summer night to talk about crime victims and offenders and crime victimization, a dark subject. I'll just tell you a little bit of how this is going to go. I don't know how long I'll be able to leave my jacket on, but I like my jacket if I can leave it on. So, but if I get hot, I'll have to throw it off, which is another show in itself. I'm going to speak with some prepared remarks for 15 or so minutes, and then I'm going to throw it open to conversation. That's where it gets really good for me, and I want to invite you and beseech you to challenge me. If you hear something that you think deserves challenging, challenge me, because I actually love that, because that's what I love most about this work, that we're in the middle of a big conversation, those of us who work in this field. And what I want to do tonight is to try and illuminate what is, for most people, a little-known territory. And when I said restoring the roots of restorative justice, I'm referring to the challenge of making sure that restorative justice practices are victim-centered. You'll hear me use that word a few more times this evening. But restoring those roots fits here in the shadow of Forest Farm, because there are parallels that are apt for me. And so I appreciate this opportunity. I appreciate Zoe inviting me, which is the same thing as ordering me, if you know Zoe.
Then why did it take so many emails to get
Because I have such authority issues. I tried. You know, are you sure you want me? Don't you realize how bad this could be? But again, I want to not only thank you for being here, but thank you for whatever will happen tonight. Helps me wrestle with the sort of the dimensions and domains of this field that I work in. It's my second chosen field. As Holly mentioned, I came to the coast as a boat builder, came to this part of the coast as a magazine publisher, although that was way more than that makes more of what I actually knew. I did not know what I was doing, and for the most part still don't. But what we're talking about tonight is not boats, but the land of victimization and violation, which is, for those who've suffered this kind of experience, is a territory that is so barren and so desolate and so hopeless that it is almost unspeakable. And I'm speaking of these victim survivors of crimes of severe violence and violation, and by that I mean crimes like murder, rape, and attempted murder. Victims and survivors whose lives have been turned upside down in unspeakable ways by the trauma of it all. These are the people for whom the words good life feel like they might never be able to be spoken again, much less thought again. These are survivors who are serving prison sentences of their own, from which they'll never be released. They've been put there by offenders who, for the most part, really have no idea of the damage that they've unleashed. And therein lies the true challenge of our justice system, to make offenders understand the impacts of what they've done. Now, you might think this would be a simple thing. Make offenders understand the impacts of what they've done. You might think that this is what our correctional system is doing, that this is how correcting works. But you'd be wrong for the most part. In our system of corrections, an offender can serve his entire sentence without ever being required to talk about his crime or his victims, without ever having to account for what he's done, for his choices and his behaviors. And just incidentally, as a way of making my life easier, I always say he when I refer to offenders and she when I refer to survivors. Obviously, the opposite happens, or maybe not obviously, but for me it's just easier to say he and she. That's why I keep doing that. You'll keep hearing that. So they can serve their entire sentences without ever having to talk about their crimes, without ever being required to talk about their crimes, which to me is just crazy. In effect, it's possible under our system to basically sleepwalk through an entire decades-long sentence in prison. And I've known plenty of offenders who are doing just that. So what does this mean? Well, in simplistic terms, it's the equivalent of sending a child to his room and saying, you just think about what you did for a while, and expecting him to understand all he needs to understand about what he's done the same way we understand it. That's what we do with offenders. We send them to their room, tell them to think about what they've done for years or for decades, but we don't offer them any real help. Well, that's not true. We don't direct them toward real help. We like to imagine that if we give them enough time to do that, they'll realize the error of their ways. The problem is, for me, from my perspective after 16 years in this field, they already realize the errors of their ways. Their struggle is to stop thinking in these erroneous ways. So is it any wonder that our prison system has a failure rate, which means the recidivism rate, which means offenders returning to prison within 3 years of release, that averages around 60% nationally? Is it any wonder that we have such a failing system? But because we equate punishment with accountability, as we do, we assume that punishment alone is enough. And the evidence couldn't be clearer that it's not, because we have a roughly 60% recidivism rate. And those rates by state vary, but nationally that's the average. This has been our practice forever. Lock them up, hope they think about what they've done, hope they change, hope they learn their lessons. And some do. Jail or prison can be enough for some offenders to change the way they think. Excuse me. And let's understand that thinking is the primary factor that drives criminal behavior. It's what we call in this context criminal thinking. The factor that separates those who commit crimes from those who think about them but decide not to. But in terms of how offenders think about their crimes and how jail or prison affects them, jail being, just for clarification for those who don't know, basically a year or under a year is, if you're doing that kind of sentence, you're going to be doing it in jail. If you're doing longer than a year, you're going to be doing it in prison. So many of them, they remain right in that place where they're not really thinking about, why I did what I did, because thinking about it is hard and complicated, and nobody is requiring them to. So the opportunities that they're offered to make changes in their thinking, they don't think they apply to them. For whatever reason, and there are lots of reasons, and we can talk about this. After I finish this part of it, we can talk about anything you want to talk about. They're offered to make changes. They're offered opportunities to learn how to make changes in their thinking. Many of them don't. Some of them do. Some of them don't change their thinking even after having the opportunities. But what we need to know is this, that while criminal thinking isn't easy always to change, it is one of the so-called criminogenic needs that can be changed. And that's one of the reasons that I happen to love victim-offender dialogue when it's victim-centered, because victim-offender dialogue is an opportunity to work with an offender and with a survivor to help them understand the impacts of, help the offenders understand the impacts of what they've done. And think about it in the context of choices they made, impacts that they caused and created, choices that they made. And for me, it offers one of the most powerful opportunities to help offenders think differently, or think differently about thinking differently about what they've done. Because in VOD, victim offender dialogue, the survivors are coming into the prison, this is after much preparation, maybe a year, and they're demanding that these offenders account for themselves, that they explain themselves, that they say, this is what I think led me to do what I did. Not the excuses, but explanations. So what's unusual about that? For most of these offenders, a victim-offender dialogue with a survivor is the first time in their lives that they will have been asked or invited or expected to explain themselves. First time in their lives. How can that system work? This was a total surprise to me when I first learned that. But here's our problem. VODs are happening in this tiny realm of survivors who have asked for it in the states that have these crimes, that have these programs. And there are still 19 states in this country that do not allow victim-offender dialogues in crimes of severe violence. So what I'm guessing, this is a guess, but it's a pretty good guess, in the roughly 23 years only that victim-offender dialogue has been going on in crimes of severe violence in this country, there have probably only been 1,000 victim-offender dialogues. Out of the, we know we have millions of people, 2.2 million as I guess it, in jails and prisons. That's an estimate, but it's a drop in the bucket, as you can see. So what does that mean for us? Well, a couple of things. First, there's a lot of talk about the problem, actually the crisis, because it is one, of mass incarceration. That's the thing that so many people talk about. But second, there's a lot of silence about the crisis of crime victimization. And that's why I'm here tonight, to maybe plant a few seeds along that line. So by some estimates, there are 2.2 million people locked up in our country's jails and prisons. In our prisons alone, where the sentences served are longer than a year by definition, there are almost 1.6 million people locked up. But who are these people? Well, although estimates differ, somewhere between a third and a half of the offenders in prisons are convicted in nonviolent crimes. And yes, some of these should definitely be getting medical help instead of punishment alone. But I'm not here to talk about them tonight. On the other hand, let's be conservative. Let's say that half of the 1.6 million in prisons are locked up for so-called violent crimes. What do we mean by violent crimes? Well, according to the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting System and Program, these are the violent crimes by their definition. This is where they come up with how many violent crimes there are. Crimes that involve force or threat of force in murder, non-negligent manslaughter, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. Let me repeat that. Force or threat of force in murder, non-negligent manslaughter, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. So these are the kinds of crimes and violations I work with. There's a whole range of that area with victim survivors and offenders. These are the crimes and violations that traumatize their victims and leave them carrying degrees of devastation and post-traumatic stress that are very hard to put words to. But the sheer volume of these crimes isn't widely known at all. For example, in 2014, the most recent year for which we have pretty reliable numbers, the FBI has provided this in the Uniform Crime Reports, the number of violent crimes. So murder, non-negligent manslaughter, rape, robbery, aggravated assault. Anybody care to hazard a guess how many violent crimes by the FBI's definition there were in this country in 2014? Just any guess? 100,000? Any other? So that's way low. How many? 3.5 million, did you say? Okay. So the number, so there's the range, right? So this is how little we actually know. The FBI says there were 1,165,383 violent crimes in 2014. Does that number surprise you? It doesn't surprise you because you just guessed 3.5. So it's lower than you thought. But I mean, over 1 million violent crimes in a year. Talk about crazy. Looking back, just in the 2 decades between 1995 and 2014, the total number of violent crimes were 28,092,952. 28 million over a mere 20 years. That's an average of about 1,405,000 a year, approaching about twice as many violent crimes per year as we have violent offenders living in prison. If we take the definition of 800,000 offenders convicted of violent crimes in the prison system, if we accept that. In any case, there's the relationship of numbers. So we do hear a lot about mass incarceration, but we never talk about mass victimization. We hardly talk about a single victimization. I don't know why we don't talk about that crisis. So the average is a little lower because violent crime has been decreasing. If you take the 5 years between 2010 and 2014, there were just over 6 million violent crimes, or an average about 1,200,000 crimes per year, but 1.2 million. That's still 1 1/3 times the number of violent offenders currently in prisons. These are numbers most of us don't talk about, most of us don't hear about because nobody's talking about them. And remember, I'm just talking about the number of crimes. Crimes. Keep in mind, these crimes affect whole families. 2 people, 4 people, 6 people, sometimes rippling out to 10 people according to the research. So if you do the math, those 1.2 million violent crimes just in 2014, they created somewhere between 2.5 million and 12 million victims survivors, which we call victim survivors, in just 1 year. I'm making up this number. I'm using it as a statistic, but I just want to get the relationship of victimizations. Crimes is one thing. It's a huge number, 1.2 million. Victims could be 2.5 to 12 million a year. They're so staggering, these numbers, that they defy credulity. But these survivors often feel so silenced by their experiences that we mostly never hear about them unless we know them personally. So this is the crisis I found when I began looking closer at the struggles of victim survivors of violent crime back in 1999 when I was publishing Hope magazine. The crisis of the silenced. The ones whose stories remain held and hidden inside because no one really wants to hear them, because they're hard to hear and sometimes hard to believe and always impossible to fix. But here's the great irony of all this. It is way easier for most people to, quote-unquote, identify with offenders than it is to identify with victim survivors. So why is that? Well, for one thing, we tend to think that we can easily imagine what it would feel like to be locked up, to lose our ability to control our circumstances, right? And we can imagine it to some extent. But victimization is very different. It's so traumatizing that its effects are almost unimaginable. So here's just a general sampling of the standard impacts and effects of violence and violation. Sleeplessness and persisting nightmares, constant flashbacks and intrusive thoughts and feelings, extreme tension and anxiety, irritability and outbursts of anger, lack of involvement or connection with the external world, prolonged feelings of estrangement from others, even loved ones, problems remembering things. These are sort of the general symptomatology of trauma and post-trauma. These are just words to most of us, but they're part of the daily lives of survivors. And all the while, their loved ones are often urging them to move on or urging them to forgive and forget what was done to them, which is so easy for others to say. Just forgive and forget. Just move on. And many survivors, it pains me to see this, but many survivors do wonder why they aren't strong enough to just move on. But the real problem is that moving on from trauma isn't simply a decision. And I know I'm obviously not a psychologist, but one thing we now know for sure is that trauma lodges in the brain. And it lives there, sometimes for decades, until it can be safely and fully talked out. That's what facilitators of victim offender dialogues get to do with survivors and with some offenders who want to do that. And this was the other thing that I found when I began looking closer at the struggles of victim survivors of violence and violation. All they really need is to be with someone who is really listening and really hearing. That's what they need. Here's their pain, here's their anguish, here's their grief, here's their anger, and sometimes even their compassion and mercy. The problem is that too many of us want survivors to feel compassion or even forgiveness, what we in this field call the F word, way before its time has come, before the harvest time, as it were, before anything is even known, really, about how much responsibility an offender takes for his choices and his behaviors, versus how much he evades or minimizes or deflects responsibility for those choices. I train people in this work of facilitating this dialogue, these dialogues, and in my trainings I use a list of a couple of dozen evasions and minimizations and deflections, the common ways, the ways that they sort of remove themselves from responsibility for the choices, horrible choices to be sure, that they made. Choices that even though they made them, it's hard to talk about them. There are, commonly a couple of dozen ways. Some of these evasions come out of what they learned about excuse making and how that helped them. And some of it comes out of their just absolute intention to evade. It's more intentional than event related, whatever. It's more intentional. Basically, to make anyone or anything but themselves responsible for what they did. It's amazing how many offenders do this in a variety of ways. Bless you. But these kinds of evasions can be among the most re-victimizing, re-wounding of the wounds that survivors live with in the long-term aftermath of victimization. And yet they're the kinds of things that most of us hardly ever think about because we don't have to. The reason this matters is because accountability, that big word, is what survivors want from offenders. They don't want their excuses. They don't want their yearnings for cheap grace or easy forgiveness. They want these offenders to own what they did. And this is where the terms people use to describe restorative justice can dramatically diverge. And I want to talk with you about some of my experiences with victims and survivors and offenders, and we can take that anywhere you want tonight. But before I get into that, I just want to ask one basic question that anybody or several of you can volunteer your answers for. In a court, when an offender is ordered to pay restitution to his victim as part of the sentence, assuming a conviction, the offender is ordered to pay restitution. Is that, in anyone's mind, an expression of restorative justice as you understand restorative justice to this point? I'll take head shakings and head nods. So I'm seeing more head shaking. Any nods that it is restorative justice?
It can be part of the repair agreement.
Right. So this is the thing. I've had all kinds of answers. I always ask this question when I'm addressing groups of people like this, for whom this is not everyday work. Most people shake their heads. And I say, why, or why not? And they say, well, because there's no buy-in from the offender. So, buy-in from the offender. When you think about violent crime, victimization, and violation, you think about playing fair. Where was the fairness on the day or night of the victimization or violation? When a survivor says, I will feel better if I know that he's paying money that he has to work for, that to me is restorative justice. So I'm with Hadley's take on it. If the survivor feels this is reparative, it's reparative. Because who is restorative? Who is justice for? Let's understand what this is all about. Because restorative justice has sort of been co-opted by groups of people who are very offender-oriented, because offenders you can see what needs to change in an offender. And if you're an activist and an outreach person with an offender, you go, I can help this person. I might be able to help this person change. That's very, very appealing. With a survivor, there is nothing we can do. There is nothing we can do to change what happened. In my work, I'm very lucky because there is something I can do, and all I have to do is just listen. But what I want us all to understand is that justice was meant to provide a way for survivors, victims, to feel a little repaired, a little more whole again than they were when their lives were turned upside down. So when they say that restitution is possible and they want restitution, and they feel satisfied because they got to say something about what that offender now must do after what he did to her, the fact that they feel justice is what I want for them. That's what I want for them. So that, that's how I see it. But let's just talk a little bit more about restorative justice. And this is just a few more minutes of me talking at you, and we can get into the conversation, which I really hope you will be robust about. So what is restorative justice? Well, simply put, it's a way of looking at harms and crimes as injuries to persons instead of as laws broken. It's a way of examining possible repairs for the usually profoundly irreparable harms, and a way of asking whether reparations or punishment or both are what's needed. Because one thing the research has shown us clearly is that despite what many intelligent and well-meaning people want it to be, restorative justice is not an alternative to traditional justice. It's an adjunct. Most survivors want traditional justice to be applied, to be meted out, but they want to have a say. It's most aptly called a justice mechanism for survivors. That makes them most happy when they have that option, but it's not an alternative. They don't want it to be either or. There's a pretty widespread belief, some of you may know this, that the origins of restorative justice thinking in this country are rooted in indigenous tribal practices and with circles and talking pieces and healing conversations. And while some of those parallels can be found, the real roots of restorative justice in this country are much more banal in a way. They grew out of the idea of victims' restitution, which before the early 1970s did not exist. So victims of crime had nothing, no way to get anything back from, as if what had happened to them could be completely repaired, but they had no way of getting anything until victim restitution became part of the picture. But that wasn't until the 1970s. So the first real restorative justice forays in this country came out of victim restitution and offender supervision, meaning probation and parole. It had nothing to do with indigenous practices or tribal practices or healing circles or anything like that. The reason this distinction is important for me tonight is that it was not originally designed to provide some kumbaya experience where the victim offender came together and had some reconciling of their differences. Crime and violation is not a misunderstanding to be worked out. If you or someone you love has experienced it to any degree, you know what I'm talking about. But as recently as the 1970s, victims and survivors of crime were left to fend for themselves in terms of trying to make themselves whole again after the crime. More than that, this is even worse, they were left to fend for themselves in terms of how they were prepared for the release of the offenders who had victimized them. Only 32 years ago, if you were the victim of an assault, from a mild attack to a vicious rape, you could be walking down the street in your own town some years later and find yourself suddenly face to face with your assailant. Even in the case of a person who took the life of a loved one, an offender whose attorney, let's say, managed to win an acquittal or a mild sentence for his client, you could suddenly run into that person in the grocery store with no prior warning that the offender had even been due for release, let alone actually released. It's been very different since the Victims of Crime Act was passed in 1984, but this is how the new victims' rights are. And most of us have no reason to know this. This is why restorative has to be in the eye of the beholder, and how a sense of justice can be found or completely lost, depending on where we anchor our mission. And for me, after 16 years in this field, if restorative justice isn't victim-centered, it's neither restorative nor justice. That's just me. We can talk about that and anything else in just a couple of minutes. But justice is what every single victim survivor needs and deserves. By the same token, understanding and accountability are what every single offender should be called upon to deliver, in my opinion. Every single one. This can be sometimes hard for thoughtful, intelligent, and well-meaning people who haven't viewed the crime scene photos or lived in the long-term, empty, aching aftermath of victimization. It can be hard because most of us can't even imagine that people make conscious choices to harm others, but they do. They're not driven by invisible forces. Experience teaches us that many of them actually like the feeling of having power and control over others, however short-lived that feeling might be. This is just another of the invisible crises we don't talk about. Again, we want offenders to see the errors of their ways, but they do see them. The problem is, they're mostly pretty okay with the errors of their ways. So at the risk of going way out on a limb with the deep humanists here, which must be just about everybody, we could call them, I'm looking for a forest farm illusion, invasive species. Sorry. Now, I'm not suggesting we exterminate them, because we don't have to and we couldn't anyway. But we do have to acknowledge what they're capable of. And if we don't understand them and their natures, we'll continue to do this battle and we'll continue to lose. They have to be understood and they have to be worked with. We have to meet them where they are, not where we wish they would be, which is maybe more like us. It's not completely impossible, but they're not going to be hugged into transformation. And this is a true epidemic. Yes, the incidence of violent crime has been decreasing in the last couple of decades. But 1.2 million violent crimes a year, creating 2.5 to 12 million victims, is a calamitous number. And while all we need is love, our love is going to have to be tough enough to demand accountability. Because accountability is what's been missing from this equation. And those who are drawn to the ideals of restorative justice must make sure that we're not asking or expecting those victim survivors who are living with unspeakable, indescribable impacts that we can't even imagine, that we're not asking them to just have some kind of kumbaya reconciliation with their offenders. To repeat, what they need and deserve and what they want is accountability. And when they get that, which does happen when the restorative justice practice is victim-centered, then the survivors might make a place for compassion and for mercy, and sometimes even for forgiveness, but not before. In any case, it should always be up to those survivors. So let's talk about this. Challenge me any way you want. Please. That's it. Yes, Chris.
How do you find the cases that you work on, or how do they find you?
Okay, so you can all hear the question? Okay, so how do I find the cases? So I work with state corrections-based victim services agencies. I guess I can get up here. That is to say, when an offender is convicted, when a defendant is convicted and becomes an offender and goes to prison, the people who are taking care of the victim survivor during the process change from the DA's victim witness advocate to the corrections-based victim service agency. Every state has one. Maine has one. So when I do this work, I'm doing it at the request of the corrections-based victim services office. I do get calls from survivors, and if this is a Maine case, I do this in a lot of states. So if it's a Maine case, I would say you have to call Maine's victim services director, a woman named Tessa Mosier, who I've worked with for years and years, because I did the first victim offender dialogues in Maine, and we continue to do them. And then there's a process by which this all happens. But basically, I hope I'm answering your question. I'm asked by corrections-based victim services in all the states that I do. I do this in a number of states, but I'm asked by them. I do not. That's not true. I just lied. Once in a while, there was a Maine woman. There was a woman from Maine whose daughter was murdered in Virginia. This was a case I could not reach out to this. This is a mother of a 20-something daughter who was murdered by her partner in Virginia. A Maine girl living in Virginia with her partner is murdered by that partner. That partner is an African-American woman. I read the story. I read the newspaper story. And I'm thinking, this woman who's from Maine, her daughter grew up in Maine. She actually lives in New York State. Her daughter was murdered in Virginia. There is nothing more lonely than finding yourself in the middle of a violent crime victimization miasma. It's a horrible thing. So I did reach out to her. Because it was a Virginia case, at that time, Virginia did not have victim-offender dialogue. So that was another thing. So I just wrote to her and I said, I found out where she lived, and I said, you know, I can't do anything except listen. But I can only imagine what it is like for you this is just in the couple of weeks, within a couple of weeks of when this murder happened. I just want you to know that if I can do anything, I'd be glad to try. And she reached back right away, and I stayed working with her just as a listener and a kind of counselor, not in the traditional counseling way, but I've had experience with survivors who have lived through the murder of a loved one. And I have experience with the prison system. And I knew the victim services director in Virginia, so I could provide her with some insights, even though Virginia didn't have that program. It now does. I did the first cases in Virginia. Great cases. So that's an unusual situation. I just knew that there was no place she could turn. She's living in not living in her home state. Her daughter's murdered, not in her home state. You know, it's a same-sex relationship, and her partner murdered. I mean, it's just the worst combination of the worst possible things. So anyway, that we are still friends. In fact, I went to her other daughter's wedding. So anyway, but not to get too personal. Okay. Yes.
You mentioned you used the word making someone whole again, and just I was thinking about that because in our civil courts, that's like the point is to make people whole. When they bring a lawsuit and they've been damaged and they want compensation for it, and the whole legal term for it is making them whole. And it's pretty clear that on the criminal side of things, you don't have that same principle at work.
Right.
Which makes it necessary the work needed. So I was thinking, you know, Maine prison system is a little bit different from probably the national average.
Maine, say again? Maine?
The prison system is a little different, a little maybe above average than the national average or something in some ways, some characteristics. And we don't have privatized prisons here. So I just wanted to, if you could comment on the relationship of your work towards like prison advocacy as a whole, about allowing, in Maine for instance, or anywhere I guess, but allowing state prison corrections officials, administrators, whatever executive branch departments, to educate them in a way, to see that like another way is possible, another world is possible, other forms of rehabilitation or the way we treat offenders is possible. Yeah. So
are you? I just want to make sure I'm understanding your question. Are you saying make the offenders aware, or make other states aware of what Maine is doing?
Government officials.
The state corrections department?
Particularly, yes. I mean, the people that control prisons and steer the direction the prison is going. Because I'm trying to stay away from really insulting our prison system. You know, really putting the blame on them.
Right.
There's a lot of blame that can go there, but I'm just wondering if you see a benefit in your work is being able to just show that another world is possible. First of all, I'll go out on a limb and say that I have a lot of respect for the Department of Corrections. So that's a whole conversation, what they are not doing versus what the offenders are not doing. But the Department of Corrections, and in particular Maine State Prison, is very committed to programmatic changes, and there are some amazing programs that have been implemented, and they are doing a great job. In my opinion, I can say this about every Department of Corrections employee at the central office that I know is deeply committed to helping offenders do well, to go through a reentry process that can help them succeed when they come out. It doesn't look like that when you just listen to inmates or offenders talk about what life is like. It sucks in there. It sucks in every prison. I believe I've worked in 18 different states in the victim services and prisons systems. It's awful. Every state is awful. Every state has it awful. And there are some bad actors on the line in corrections, just as there are in law enforcement, just as there are in teaching, just as there are in magazine publishing. I mean, it's everywhere. But what I
I would say, and this is, this is a much longer conversation. We could really get derailed here, but in my opinion, the commitment to professional practice and to successful reentry is very high in Maine. And it is in really every state. It is very different from what it was 20 years ago. The commitment to reentry is really robust and profound. So what I want to say is, and if you talked with any, if they thought you had an agenda, you would probably get what you expected to get if you had a conversation with any of these people. But if they thought you were actually listening, I think you would hear things that you did not expect to hear about their commitment and their professionalism. But I'm not saying that the offenders would say, oh yeah, this is a great place. I mean, once in a while you'll get one who says, yeah, this is actually, I've had guys say to me, this place is a joke about Maine State Prison because they came from Maryland. It's like this is because they're much, we have 2,000 inmates at the Maine, we have 1,000 inmates at the Maine State Prison. We have 2,000 inmates incarcerated in Maine. That's nothing compared to most states. So what we do have here, and this is so important to me, we have what amounts to a lab. We can experiment, but both especially the new warden at the Maine State Prison, his program people, the department, the Department of Corrections office, there are some really rigorously committed people there. So again, I don't know if I answered your question, but I don't think anybody needs to be listening more. When people need to I will say this, I'll go out on this limb too. When people hear offenders complaining about how they're treated at a prison, you would have this in any state. You really want to get some additional information because it's very easy to say, these guys are a bunch of animals, and I'm talking about the inmates, saying these guys are a bunch of animals, they mistreat us, they abuse us, and because people want to hear that. People go, oh, that's so, I can't believe that. Why would anybody do that? Well, I mean, the expectations for professional practice are very high, and it wasn't always like that in Maine or in any state, but it's very different now. The people who are doing correctional services are doing it in a very different way. So you alluded to private corrections. I totally think that's a bad idea. I worked one case, actually two cases, for Corrections Corporation of America facilities, and I think it's a bad idea. I don't think corrections facilities should be profit enterprises.
Can I ask you?
Yep.
You're working as a volunteer in a nonprofit organization.
Right.
And I guess what I'm asking is what's going on with taxpayer-funded restorative justice types of programs, maybe not called that. And you also talked about other people.
Yeah, nothing. And the reason, pretty much, except in Vermont. Vermont has a very robust minor crimes, particularly restorative. They have community reparations board. Well, Maine, the reparations board, and are you on that?
Yeah.
So the Maine reparations board, which started back when we started it in 2000, and it didn't go anywhere because the victims just did not trust us at all. They thought, you're just trying to help the offenders. What about me? But there are some systems where taxpayer funding is provided, but the research on restorative justice is thin. You get victim satisfaction for sure, but we're not getting this clear sense that, offenders are changing. That we say that there's a reduction in recidivism, and there has been research suggests that, but our big problem in this country is that we're not funding the kind of research that needs to be done. Pew could do that, Vera Institute could do that, and they should. I want to make sure I get a chance, and so I'm going to go there and there. So
okay,
you first.
I wanted to push back a little bit on a couple of things
damn.
you said. And I guess I'll couch it in I really think there's a lot of wisdom in your emphasis on listening to people that have been victimized.
Yep.
So I'm curious, where's the interplay between trying to allow agency and involvement from the people that have been shattered and trying to mitigate how often we do terrible, unspeakable things to each other in communities. And in particular, I heard you say that, I think I heard you minimize the context and say that people do, you use the term offenders a lot, do unspeakable things because of their thinking, and they are pretty okay with their thinking.
Often.
Okay.
That's true. I did say that.
I want to, anecdotally, a lot of people who do violent things have been the victims of unspeakable abuse.
A number of them, yeah. That's true.
So, where is restorative justice headed in terms of honoring the victims? That totally resonates with me, and also mitigating unspeakable action.
Yep. Great question. So what's great about this question, this is a question that a lot of people ask. Aren't most violent offenders former victims? I don't think most of them are, but many of them are. And it might even be, you might even be able to make the case that most of them are. But I don't make that case. And one of the reasons, I'll just start by saying that one of the reasons I don't make that case is because there are many victim survivors walking among us who have been horrifically betrayed, horrifically victimized, who would not hurt a soul. That, to me, immediately takes off the table that if you have been victimized, ergo you victimize others. And I agree. Hurt people, hurt people. No, let me just see if I can take this a little further. I'm not sure that I can to your satisfaction, but I definitely appreciate this question because it's a big one. It comes up a lot. So we take it as a given that hurt people, but hurt people also don't hurt people and wouldn't hurt people, and that's where I want to make sure that we recognize that truth first. Given the fact that offenders they're convicted of something, of having done something to someone, and once they've become used to the fact that they're in there, and they feel ready to address their behaviors, their choices and behaviors, on the most recent victimization. That is, the last thing that happened was you victimized her. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about the last thing that happened. In the course of our preparation, it could come out, as it does with some offenders, that, this offender was sexually abused, or physically abused but not sexually, during the course of his growing up years. So what do we do with that? Because this is a person who was himself traumatized by something in his childhood and may or may not make something of it. Some people, you can go to an offender who's been through that, who will never mention it unless you pull it out of him. And some people, when you sit down, I sat down with a murderer one time and he said, I was abused as a child. Well, if that's your first line, I am skeptical about how this is going to go. So I don't mind acknowledging that there were offenses, but even in a sexual predators group, you might get 70% at the highest to say, I was sexually abused, and that's what made me become a sexual abuser. But in fact, there are still 30%, even if you believe that claim, there are still 30% who say, no, I wasn't. I just liked this feeling. I liked this feeling of being able to control somebody, to have power over somebody. So what I'm trying to get at in my work is, what is your explanation? How do you explain yourself? And they won't say, for the most part, except this guy that I just alluded to, they will start to, when you ask them the question and accept whatever their answer is, then they can actually think about the words they're forming for this. They can actually think about, okay, this is, how did this happen? Well, I needed money, I was hooked on drugs, or I wasn't, or, I did enjoy this, or I didn't enjoy it, but I needed the money. I mean, when you get them to talk about it, they feel agency, which is the question I hear deep, that's the underlying question. They feel that sense of agency because someone is listening to them too. What we have to do is remember why I'm there, why I'm in the room, why he's having a conversation with me, which is because the victim has asked to have a conversation some months down the road with that offender. So we just have to get things in order. And if he wants to talk about that, because he's not going to get therapy in prison, that's not an option. He might be able to see a counselor, but none of them would say that's very helpful counseling work. But, you know, now he's getting to say, okay, this was part of it, but it's, and they will all, most all say, this is no excuse, but, you know, this is what happened. So, am I getting to an answer?
I think so. I mean, I was just curious if you have a dual emphasis. I think that it is very commendable to try and restore someone who's been shattered in any way you can by supporting and listening and giving them some control if you can. But isn't it also part of our task to mitigate the numbers of times we do unspeakable things to each other? And
I'll say.
I don't think saying that people are pretty okay with their criminal thinking is the way to do that.
Well, you'd have to observe a bunch of offenders in prison talking about this to come to that conclusion. I wouldn't say it if I hadn't learned this from them. They really are pretty okay with it. So that may be a separate subject.
We might just disagree.
Yeah, we might. But the important part of my work is that it's victim-centered. That's the anchoring point. But it's offender-sensitive. So here's how when I do these trainings, I don't know if I can do this in a way that everybody can see, but, you know, so I say that we have to anchor our work in meeting the needs of the victim survivor. And once we anchor that work, we can work as we need to. But if we don't anchor that work somewhere, every time I go in to see a sympathetic offender, I'm going, you know, oh my God, you know, this is heartbreak. What happened to you is heartbreaking. I leave the prison, I go to the victim's house, and I listen to what happened to her, and oh my God, this is heartbreaking. What am I going to do with this? I'm being thrown back and forth between these two. Well, how do I make that work? Well, here's how I do it. This is what I do in the trainings. We have to anchor our work in meeting the needs of the victim survivor. Everything else is possible when we do that, because if I'm here for her with this foot anchored, I'm here, you know, I'm listening to her, I'm being sympathetic to what it is that she's bringing up and out. But when I go into the prison, as long as that foot is anchored, I can come all the way over to here. I can embrace you without ever losing that anchoring point. And because of that, I can be as embracing as I need to be in the interest of this work on behalf of the victim survivor. So when I do that, that's what I call being offender sensitive while being victim centered. So that works for me in the trainings it works. But that's the only way I can do it. So I hope that's an answer. You had your hand up, and I don't know how we're going to do this, but I just want you to know it's 8 o'clock. But
yeah. Does Vermont have the DOD?
Yes, it does. Yep.
Okay. I was at a COSA training there.
Yep. Yep.
And there was a woman who spoke up, and she said she was a victim's advocate.
Yep.
I don't remember if she said she worked for the state of Vermont, but she was there at the COSA training.
Yep.
And it felt like she was challenging, to me it did, the COSA program a bit.
Okay, so we have to talk a little bit about what the COSA program is. So COSA is Circles of Support and Accountability, which is my shorthand way of describing COSA is it's like an AA program with a bunch of sponsors who are like 24/7 sponsors. So if you're a sex offender released, you are basically what they call it in Canada warrant expiry, I think is the name of it. So you're an offender who is now released and not under supervision because you've served your sentence, but you're a sex offender. And your sex offenders, they have to manage their addictions. They have to manage their behaviors. These are not people who get it, get cured, and go home. They're always going to be wrestling with these yearnings. And so the COSA program, Circles of Support and Accountability, is made of, and they have a number of cities in Canada, and Vermont has one, and a number of other states have them in this country. There are people from probation, from law enforcement, and community members who want to provide support for the returning sex offender nobody wants him in their community. Nobody wants to talk with him. These are people who have done despicable things. And they struggle. So you basically you meet with this group, you get this circle together, and the sponsors take turns being your 24/7, 24-hour sponsor. So on Tuesday, this sex offender is in my care. So he could call me. As this is you must have seen the film that Robin Wilson did. Anyway, okay, I won't make it inside baseball. So here's the example that was shown in the film with a sex offender. He's downtown in Toronto, and as he said, my thrill is adolescent boys. My thrill is I just want to take them home. So he's in downtown Toronto at a video game parlor because that's where his thrill assembles. So he goes, holy smokes, I'm really in trouble here because what I want to do is take that boy home. So I call my sponsor. I'm his sponsor. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm asleep, and he calls me. And my commitment is I go down and get him, and I take him to the all-night coffee shop, and we just sit there and have coffee until he's calmed down. That's COSA. And it is, I mean, people don't always last long in COSA because it's grueling. Because these are offenders who dare to be honest about what they're struggling with every day. They're struggling with it. They don't want to be like this, but they're like this. So these COSA sponsors help them get through that, that brief moment. So some victims feel like and this is always the problem. Victim advocates, offender advocates. It's just it's a little bit like what just happened between you and me. It's like this doesn't seem quite fair or right, or in terms of the offender's agency, and you're like, and it happens at extreme levels. I mean, it can be the antipathy can be very extreme between offender advocates and victim advocates. And victim advocates feel that offender advocates just don't get it. They don't understand what the victim has been through. And that's pretty much true, except in that film that I described, there was a rape survivor who was part of the COSA group, and she was tough, but great. She also left. I mean, I think she said she was there for a year or so. That was all she could do. I mean, it's grueling work, again. So, anyway, that's really a problem. So we have to be able to find that, people like me, have to be able to find that way of saying, we can do this in a victim-centered way and still be sensitive to offenders. We can do it in a way that says to the offender, I understand something about what you're wrestling with. We can do that. But we have to be able to, we have to face that, what they're struggling with. We have to make them talk about or invite them to talk about what they're struggling with. That can be hard because it's shameful stuff to talk about. That's sex offending, that's a whole different order of magnitude. Somebody else had yes, way in the back.
Yeah.
And then you.
I'm just wondering, how do you orchestrate the victim offender dialogue, and what do you actually do?
So what do I do? How do I orchestrate the victim offender dialogues? What do I actually do? Well, I don't do much. I am just a listener. So my job is to listen to the survivor. My first job, my primary job, is to listen to the survivor. I need to know what she wants to say to the offender and what she wants to ask of the offender. As I do that, I'm conveying that information to the offender, with her permission, whatever she allows me to convey. And I then go into the prison. I start with the victim, survivor. Go into the prison, I say, these are some of the things she wants to say and ask to you, say to and ask of you. How are you with this? And we've got months and months to go. This process could take a year in preparation. So I go to the offender. This is what she wants to say. This is what she wants to ask. How do you respond, basically? I mean, I'm building a relationship with each. So I can't do this if the offender doesn't trust me. I can't do this if the survivor doesn't trust me. So I have to be authentic. Talk about agency. If I'm not authentic with this offender, if I'm just trying to scam him, these guys, they're professional cons. They would see right through that. So I have to be real. I have to find a way to be completely human. I have to find something to connect with that offender. But it's not as hard as it seems, unless the offender is, like if he's a sexual sadist or if he's a non-sexual sadist, if he's just a sadist, if he's is so severely psychopathic that, you know, he feels nothing and is only manipulative. I mean, that's a hard one. Those are hard cases to do. But once they understand the basic rule, which is, okay, this is what she wants to say to me. She wants to know what I have to say in response. So I can do this, and slowly it's a little bit of a dance. We're just working out by conversations over the course of months. These conversations are like once a month for a couple of hours each, and we're just building more understanding one of the other. So the survivor gets to know a little bit about how the offender is reacting. Like if she knows something about the case and he says, this is not what happened, but that is, and she could say, BS. That's, you know, the pictures are here, the crime scene pictures, I've seen them. You know, I heard this testimony, I believe that, I don't believe what he's saying. I mean, all those things have to be worked out, but all of it is about for me, just listening this stuff up and out of them. Beg pardon? It leads to a face-to-face, as long as everything's good. And that face-to-face can go for several hours. The longest one I know of was about 8.5 hours. The longest one I've ever been in was about 7 hours. The shortest one I've ever been in was like an hour and a half. So it varies, and it's all up to the victim survivor. You know, she's the one who's saying, I've learned a lot about him, or, you know, if she's saying it to him, I've learned a lot about you over these months. This is what I feel about what you're saying. I believe you or I don't believe you. It's hard for some offenders to be truthful. It's just plain hard. So, but by the time of the dialogue, my work is done. Basically, what I want is for the survivor, whose role this is to control the conversation now, because control is what was taken away from her at the time of the crime. This is the first real sense of, okay, I feel in control because I'm getting to have this conversation. I'm leading this conversation. And it's not like they want to come in and rant and rave, because they don't. Some of them have angry things to say. I just say, keep in mind that he has every right to get up and walk out of the room if he feels like you're coming down too hard on him, or if, you know, you're not giving him a chance or something like that. And she, by the same token, could do that too. She could say, you're just full of it. I'm leaving. I'm done. That hasn't happened to me, but it could happen. So, is that okay answer? Okay.
The other question is, are you always there with?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's just us three in the room, in the prison. Security can see in, but they can't hear what's being said for privacy and confidentiality. And I can't remember your name, but Lori, you had a question?
I have quite a bit, but one thing I wanted to say, I think that Alice Miller talks about enlightened witness, because you bring up the victimization, you know, the trauma of what the offender has been through. And what she offers is that if people have been through severe trauma and that's all they know, they will often repeat it. But if they have enlightened witness who may not have been able to stop it, but showed them that somehow there was another way, they may be able to find that other way. And I think that's important for us to think about when I'm being very re-triggered now, and I don't know whether to say it, but I feel like I want to in this room, because it happened that someone I know, 2 people I know were murdered, and I never talk about it. Very, very rare that so I'm shaking right now.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, my brother's best friend and his wife, and my brother was supposed to be with them. He happened in Vermont. And the guy turned himself in an hour later. He had been in, what's that word, foster care. The policeman knew him because of his background.
Yeah.
He turned himself in. But because of that, I've been grappling for decades of what you're talking about. Are you familiar with the Fortune Society in New York City?
No.
I can talk to you about that
Okay.
afterwards. But one thing they have is an alternative to incarceration program. This guy who does a radio show, he's in his 80s. He does amazing prison advocacy work.
I have heard of this, yeah, now that you mentioned the guy.
David Rothenberg.
Yeah, right.
And there's also another one in New York and San Francisco called the Lancey Foundation.
Delancey Street, yeah.
Yeah, you know that one
Yep.
too. So instead of going to jail, they go to the Lancey. There are no guards, there are no guns.
Right.
They're under 24-hour supervision
Right.
with each other. And they learn anger management,
Right.
and they come with nothing. The guy, when we were there, he said, they come with absolutely nothing. They're given clothes, they're given,
Right.
he said the only thing we come with is our word.
Right.
And he said his grandmother was so grateful that finally he could be honest. But for me, part of the conversation, it's just not it's not only the personal trauma that you brought up, you know, but the whole society. Like one of the things the Fortune Society, they have the Castle Gardens, where they give housing to people who are coming out, as well as all types of support. But they actually have a play, and there are 4 of them, and they tell their life story.
Yeah.
My name is,
Right.
I was in prison, I did this.
Right.
And the stories they tell of their childhood, it's unfathomable
Yeah.
to people who haven't been through it. In the end, they say, my name is, I have a job at, and I did that.
Yeah.
And they go around. But, you know, you hear of, I mean, I'm here it's a good life. The air smells good, we have food to eat, things are good here.
Right.
And where they come from, you know, inner city where the guns are going off and the drugs. So I think your work is very valuable, but it opens up so much more about what is creating.
Right. Right. And so here,
And also, I want to mention one other thing is war. Because people come back from war where they've been taught to kill.
right.
And also some of them who are potters have talked to me, because one was lucky to be saved by his pottery teacher. But they said they feel they can't even talk to their spouse, only other people who've been through it with them.
Right.
But on a day-to-day basis, their coping mechanisms, they're shot, and our government, doesn't give them what they need to re-enter.
Right.
And some of them are the ones who are,
Yeah.
some of them.
Yeah.
I hope.
Okay. Thank you, Peter, and then Hadley.
It's just interesting that the questions all return to the offender.
I know.
Yeah.
And so my question to you is, how do you, when you have an essential imbalance, can you use a fair process, a balanced process to redress an imbalance? And what I think you're doing is exactly the opposite. That you, in the name of restoring an equation of justice, you're actually focusing on the forgotten piece of the thing. So here we go again, talking about what we're going to do about the offenders,
Right.
and we don't give a hoot about what happens to the people.
And I really appreciate your observation. And I don't think it's that we don't give a hoot. And I'm sure you've heard me say this sometimes, because I get so frustrated about this. But it's so hard when the survivors are reluctant to speak out, because they're afraid somebody's going to bring up the offender. Well, you know, he must have had a bad life, but they didn't go through what the survivor went through. Which for them it doesn't matter, because maybe they had a bad life too. But this is the challenge, and this is why it can be hard, because I'm so focused on this need for the victim-centered approach, because it always works. And I'll just want to tell 2 anecdotes about this. The first one has to do with I did a training in New York I guess it was 2003, for facilitators. One of them was an Episcopal minister who had worked at Sing Sing for 30 years. This at the time was a 6-day training that I and my colleague did. So on the morning of the 3rd day, it's very intense. These trainings are very intense. They're only for corrections-based victim services agencies. But on that morning, we're sitting in a circle, processing the previous day's work. And he says, this is a man who's probably about my age. He was about 70 at the time. He said, when it came his turn to speak, he said, I've been working at Sing Sing with offenders for 30 years, and I cannot believe that not once have we ever talked about the victim. And that's the problem, because there is no real framework for doing this. And it was totally eye-opening for him, and that's why we did the trainings that way then, and why I do them my way now. There is an awakening that has to happen that makes you go, okay, this is why he's here. Somebody got hurt. Yes, maybe he was hurt himself, but he made a choice to hurt somebody. This is why we're here right now. maybe we can do something further with that. The second anecdote is this. I worked with a woman who read about me somewhere and inquired about it, and she ran a theater program in a prison in New York. I won't even identify which prison. And she had fallen in love with a guy who had brutally murdered somebody. And so she was talking about how she wanted to have him do this kind of testimony thing, like what he'd learned in prison. And I said, well, so if he were doing this testimony to the family of the man he murdered, how would his testimony be different? And she emailed me back and she said, oh my God, I've never even thought about that. And that's where we are, because the offenders, we know how lonely we would be. You talk to offenders in prison, they're very charismatic. Some of them are very authentic and very sincere. Some of them are not so. But it's very hard for your heart not to go out to some of them. But, you know, if you're talking with their victim, you have a whole different picture. But those victims are afraid to speak up because they're afraid this is what's going to happen. They're going to say, well, don't you think he must have been abused? Well, maybe. But let's talk about what happened to me. This is what happened most. This is the choice he made. So what happened to him was not a choice he made, but what he did to me was a choice he made. Let's talk about that. And then once they get used to talking about that in that framework of accountability, they like it. And in fact, they will say, you know, people would get nervous in my trainings. People would go, don't be too hard on these offenders. They might have had some bad experiences. Well, they might have. But oddly enough, the true authority for an offender is the victim. The judge is not the authority. The prosecutor is not the authority. The warden, the COs, these are not the authority. The authority, the one authority that they universally acknowledge is the victim. If she wants to come in here and yell at me, if she wants to come in here and spit in my face, she has that right. That's what we want for them. And when they are held to account by their victims, they feel totally new because they have allowed themselves to be accountable to the person they directly harmed for the first time, because they couldn't do that in the courtroom. They couldn't do it under any circumstances until this moment. Hadley, you want to say something?
Two questions. Do you ever incorporate victim surrogates in your practices? Because the victim might feel you just can't get him or her to take that next step. And then the second question is, when you're sitting down, is this getting close to the offender re-entering, or? Not necessarily. Okay, so it doesn't matter. It's just whenever the time is right.
Yeah. So timing, usually it's, you know, they should have been in 5 years or so, because for the first few years the offender's going, you know, I'm going to beat this case. You know, I just had a bad lawyer. I'm appealing. If they're appealing, they're not even eligible. So timing it matters. And in fact, we don't want them to be getting out too soon if we can help it. Because, you know, if they're on their way out, they're not engaged in the sort of accountability process as much. But I've also done cases on parole and probation, so it can be done. Victim surrogate. So it's interesting that you put it that way, because most of the victims have decided they want to do this. So they might have an offender who says, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do it because I have nothing to say to her. I don't want to do it because I'm afraid of her. I don't want to do it because they have every right to say no. And for a victim, that can be horribly unjust. But they have to have that right. We do offender surrogates. I've done a couple of those. In the sense that, you know, by definition, when you do an offender surrogate for the victim survivor, you're also doing a victim surrogate for the offender. I did one in a serial rapist case that was amazing. I just totally wish I had recorded it, but I did not. And it was amazing for the survivor to hear this other rapist. He wanted to apologize. And it was amazing for him to hear her talk about what she wanted to talk about with him. The reason we did a surrogate was because her offender refused to meet. He was convicted. He was serving a life sentence. He's an admitted serial rapist, but denied raping her. So it gets complicated, but surrogacy does and can work. But it's a little bit delicate, but it definitely can work.
If you do that, it is with an offender, someone who did the same crime?
Yes, you An offender identifies himself by writing to victim services and saying, I'd like to apologize to in this case, one of my victims. He acknowledged 14 rape victims. He wanted to apologize to one of them. And because of the way victim services work, unless the survivor had said, if he ever writes about wanting to apologize to me, I want to know. Otherwise, I don't want to hear. Most of them say, I don't want to hear anything about him. So victim services directors would not pass that letter on, except through a victim advocate who is working more closely with the survivor. So I'm not sure. Jody?
I would like to know what connotation you put on the F word, as I generally think that forgiveness is in the context of some religious need.
Yeah. Religious need, is that what you said?
Well,
No, whatever. I just want to make sure I heard you right. Yeah. Yeah. So,
and if not, then what brings satisfaction to the victim?
right. Well, this is a complicated, wonderful question. So, I hope you guys brought your sleeping bags. So, forgiveness, the F word as we call it. Many survivors have experienced, and not all, but many survivors have experienced this. You need to forgive and forget. This is eating you up. If you just forgive him, you'll be able to move on. Many survivors would love to be able to just forgive him, but they can't. Many survivors feel that their spiritual or religious beliefs call them to forgive the offender, and they have a really hard time wrestling with that because the authority of their religious beliefs, works hard on them. Some survivors feel, I should be able to forgive him because isn't that the most amazing thing we can do? Forgive someone who has hurt us. So they deal with tremendous sort of imperatives on a kind of daily basis about what they should do. And there are a lot of people out there saying, number one, you should forgive him, or number two, you should never forgive him. And they're just caught in this storm. So when I come to them, they might say, and I'll tell you a story. They might say, well, I'll just tell the story. I guess I don't need to say anything else. I'll just tell you a story. So I worked with a woman whose 2 daughters had been sexually victimized by their father, her husband. For a number of years, at one point, overlappingly. And he had been sentenced when the younger daughter disclosed to a teacher about what was happening. He was arrested, taken out of the house, and at first he pled not guilty, and then when the time for the trial came up, he pled guilty. He was sentenced to 40 years. And this is a Louisiana case. So when I called this woman, so 10 years into the 40-year sentence, the woman wants to have a victim-offender dialogue with the husband, and at that time they called me in because of the protocols, the policies that they had in place in Louisiana. So I came as an outsider. So I was glad to be able to take the case. I called the woman and I said, so this is my standard operating procedure. I call up and I say, here, I just want to listen to you for a little bit. I'm going to come and meet you before I go in to see him, but just tell me now, basically, what do you want from this dialogue? And he said, well, I want to forgive him. And I said, okay. So, and with, I hope you can see that I would ask this with respect. I said, so does he deserve your forgiving? And she said immediately, well, in God's eyes he does, so I should be able to forgive. And I said, okay. So I just want you to know that the way I do this, I'm not going to tell him that you intend to come in and forgive him. I just need you to know this. Because if I tell him that, then in my view, all he has to do is wait for you to come in and forgive him, and he never has to explore the reaches of personal accountability for what he did and why he did it, because I now know that part of what she wanted to understand was how he could do this to their daughters. So I just need you to know I'm not going to, if you want to forgive him on the day of the dialogue, if you get in there to the table and you feel that he deserves your forgiveness, great. I'm going to do everything I can to help you do that, whatever you want. But I'm not going to bring it up until then. And she got that, understood all that. And I said, and if you never want to talk about forgiveness during our preparation process, that's fine. And if you want to talk about forgiveness, you want to wrestle with it, I'd be glad to talk about it with you. I have lots of resources for survivors and offenders to read during the preparation process if they want. So, you know, we start the preparation. She's all good with this. We start the preparation process. I go see her. I go see him. He's in a prison not far from where she lives. I meet the daughters who were the direct victims, and I go through this a couple of times, and I realize that he, like most sex offenders, has a very, very sanitized view of what he did. Very different from the daughter's view of what he did. And the mom, because she's their mom, never really knew because there wasn't a trial, because he pled guilty when it came time for a trial. And he, like many sex offenders, pled guilty because he did not want this to come out. The girls would testify, it would be hard on them. They were in their late teens by this time, or mid to late teens. You know, so he pled guilty. So the mom didn't know, and the girls didn't want to tell her, because it's, you tell your mother what your father did to you sexually over a number of years, that's pretty hard. So the mom didn't know. The father is making it what I call pretty. And so I need to get him in more of a frame of mind of, you know, what she's holding him to account for. So I say to her, do you think the girls whom I'd met would be willing to tell me what he did with you in the room? Because I need their words. I don't have any business getting this information from them if they don't want to share it. But if they do want to share it, this will help me work more effectively with him and with her, with the mom. So, because we don't know anything. Neither she doesn't know anything and I don't know anything. We just have his version and what she imagines. So she asked the daughters, and they were very fine with it. We recorded it, just audio recorded. They're talking, and they talked about the details, each one alone. And so now it's like, it's more than 10 years later, because he's been incarcerated for 10 years, and these victimizations happened when she was starting when the older one was in 6th grade. And then she aged out, and he focused on the younger one. Aged out of his preference range. So, you know, I go see him after, well, anyway, by about the 3rd session, you know, after we've had the conversation with the second daughter about what he did, that is going okay. It was, you know, it was a little bit emotional for her, but she was, I obviously needed absolute permission from her to keep talking and to answer the questions I was asking, which are not prurient questions, but an outsider might think, well, why is he asking that? I'm trying to get at what this man did to his daughters. So we go through this, and the second one was a little more emotional for the mom. They were both difficult. So we leave. I leave. I go to the prison the next day. I come back to her house the next afternoon, and she, you know, I knock on the door. She opens the door. She says, "John." I said, "Yeah." She said, "You know that thing about forgiveness?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, I am over that." You know, and what it was, you know, it's easy to feel, I want to be able to forgive him. If you don't have to think about what he did, it's pretty easy. But the minute you start to know what he did, that's harder. And you can still decide to forgive him, but basically what she did was it just suddenly disappeared for her. And when we had the dialogue, it didn't come up. She didn't want to do it. She did a tremendous job. This was like 10 months of preparation. She did a tremendous job of holding him to account, which is the thing the daughters worried about. They worried that she would be too nice to him. So, I mean, they need the permission to feel whatever it is they want to feel. If they want to forgive, they can forgive. But not, and I'm not going to say anything until I'm not going to say anything ever. If they want to forgive him on the day of the dialogue, they will. And some people have come to this saying, I'm not going to forgive him, and decided to forgive him, and some people have come and saying, I'm going to forgive him, and decided not to forgive him. It all depends on what they feel when they see the person responding to what they're saying. So, anyway, Maybe we could have one more question because I've got to call on, yes, someone who hasn't spoken yet. Peter will wrestle me into. Say, I'm sorry.
You mentioned the 60% recidivism rate.
Yep.
In general, how is this your program, this type of restorative justice, affecting that rate?
Well, so this is the problem with measuring recidivism in crimes of severe violence. Many of the offenders aren't getting out, or they're not getting out anytime soon, because they're serving very long sentences. So recidivism is measured by people released from prison and not being reconvicted within 3 to 5 years, depending on how you're measuring it. But I make this case all the time because this is my business to try and, my mission is to get every state to have this. There are only 31 states that have this. When I started in this work in 2000, there were 6 states that did victim offender dialogue in crimes of severe violence. What we know that we can affect, we don't know that we can affect recidivism. Recidivism has been proven in minor cases to be affected positively. There's a reduction in recidivism. In minor cases. Most murderers don't go and murder again, so that's hardly a problem. Sex offenders, it's a much different matter. So, there are complications that go with this. But what I say is that this work, the work of helping survivors give voice to what they're carrying and to what they've lost, is the work of making offenders understand the impacts, the powerful human impacts of what they've done. Some offenders say, no way, I can't do that. I can't hear that. I won't do it. And we have to say, okay. But for those who do, when their understanding or lack of understanding of what they've done is affected by hearing the stories of the impacts of what they've done, their thinking changes. And criminal thinking is the factor that creates crime. Criminal thinking. It's not rocket science. They think differently about committing certain kinds of acts than we do. Period. So nobody's driving them to commit crimes unless they're starving and they need to kill something or someone to get food. But we can affect their way of thinking. Their ways of thinking can be affected. So that's the hope and promise for changing their tendency to recidivate. So Peter, I feel for you. What? No. Okay. All right. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. What a great audience.